By the spring of 1864, the Confederacy had few ships left in its navy, and almost all of its valuable ports had surrendered. Yet Lincoln knew he needed an even more aggressive commander to crush the remaining Confederate strongholds. With that in mind, he chose Ulysses S. Grant to be the new commander of the Union forces. Under Grant, the Union continued to fight the still formidable rebel army, and once again the main effort was to capture the Confederate capital of Richmond. Despite ominous dangers, heavy losses of soldiers, and defeats in battles, Grant took advantage of the Union's superiority of manpower, supplies, and financial support. His strategy was to attack the Confederacy with relentless pressure and totally destroy the South's capacity to wage war. In the East, he would confront Lee's army near Richmond and try to crush it. Grant would also send out Generals William T. Sherman and Phil Sheridan to decimate what was left of the Confederate Empire. Together, this vice-like grip would eventually strangle the South. General Grant's military plans also extended to the people, homes, food, crops, and goods of the Confederacy. Termed as total war, Union leaders purposely destroyed anything in their path, with the intent that the afflicted South would be forced to surrender. In May of 1864, while Grant's forces marched through a swampy, heavily treed area of Virginia known as the Wilderness, Lee's army launched a fierce attack upon them. A series of bloody battles known as the Wilderness Campaign was to follow. During the course of the battle, the smoldering bullets had started the area ablaze. Many wounded soldiers were trapped in the fire and died in the flames before they could be rescued. After 2 days, Grant's troops had taken a horrible beating and were forced to regroup. Lee assumed that Grant would go back to Washington as the other Union commanders had often done. But this time the aggressive Grant did not retreat. Instead, he slipped around Lee and clashed with him again at a town called Spotsylvania. In a tumultuous 8-day battle which followed, a total of almost 30,000 men were lost on both sides.
The Battle of Yellow Tavern was a cavalry battle fought on May 11th. Union Cavalry Commander General Philip Sheridan felt his cavalry could be more effective if it operated as a separate unit from the infantry. Grant was intrigued by the idea, so allowed it to happen. Sheridan got between Jeb Stuart and Richmond, destroying rail and telegraph lines. In the Battle of Yellow Tavern, Stuart was killed and Sheridan's cavalry moved towards Richmond. Sheridan went on to defeat Stuart's replacement, General Fitzhugh Lee, in the Battle of Meadow Bridge on May 12th. Sheridan's success damaged the Confederate cavalry, but while Sheridan was away fighting, Grant had to move without the benefits of the cavalry. The Battle of North Anna took place from May 23 to May 26, 1864. This battle consisted of several small skirmishes. After the stalemate at Spotsylvania Courthouse, Grant moved to the southeast, hoping to lure Lee into a battle over open ground. Lee beat Grant to the defensive position along the North Anna River. Lee and his engineers devised a masterful scheme for defensive earthworks in the shape of an inverted V that could split the Union army when it advanced and allow the Confederates to use interior lines to attack and defeat one wing, preventing the other Union wing from reinforcing. Grant initially fell into this trap. The rebels held off a Union assault, but Lee was down with an illness and his subordinates were unable to develop effective strategies. Grant again made a move southeast towards Cold Harbor. Lee later thought he had an opportunity and attacked part of Grant's army in the Battle of Totopotomo Creek. The battle result was inconclusive, but the Union continued its push southeast, while Lee lacked the ability to stop Grant from moving.
Again, Grant sidestepped Lee, only to collide with him shortly after at Cold Harbor. In one 20-minute engagement, Grant lost more than 7,000 of his troops. But Grant would not accept defeat and would let nothing stop him. Grant knew that no matter how bad his losses, he could always replace his men and supplies, something Lee could not do. Grant realized he could not break through Lee's lines by attacking from the front, so he slipped south to a vital Confederate rail and communications center called Petersburg. In a series of engagements at Petersburg, Grant could not break through Lee's defenses, so Grant put Petersburg under a siege and cut them off until they were forced to surrender. Grant sent out William Tecumseh Sherman and 3 armies of 60,000 soldiers to strike out and destroy Confederate railroad and supply communications. Sherman's armies propelled out of Chattanooga, Tennessee, and marched south to capture and burn down Atlanta, Georgia. Just as Sherman's troops took Atlanta, Navy Commander Farragut seized the last major Confederate stronghold at Mobile, Alabama. These 2 victories, Atlanta and Mobile, brought renewed hope to many Northerners, and in November of 1864, Lincoln won a toughly fought re-election as president. With Atlanta in ruins, Sherman set out to Savannah, and in a devastating 450-mile march to the sea, he destroyed almost everything in his path. His troops burned homes and farms, seized valuables, and destroyed food supplies as he executed Grant's policy of total war.
"I will make Georgia howl,"
claimed Sherman. The accounts from a former Southern slave tell the story of what it was like to be in Sherman's path. To further cripple the South, Grant sent out General Phil Sheridan and his troops to make a desert out of Virginia's lush Shenandoah Valley, one of the South's last remaining sources of foodstuffs. General Sheridan said, "Crow flying over the Shenandoah will have to bring his own rations." To many, this policy of total destruction was unimaginable. It had never before been seen. Historians often refer to the devastation of Sherman's march and Sheridan's destruction in the Shenandoah Valley as the beginning of modern warfare, or total warfare.
The war dragged on. Men on both sides continued to die, and Lincoln was anxious to end the bloodshed and devastation. The presidential election of 1864 was at hand, and in June, Lincoln was nominated for a second term. He felt that if he were re-elected, it would be a mandate from the people that they supported the emancipation of the slaves. The Democrats nominated General George B. McClellan. His campaign revolved around Lincoln's failure to end the war. Lincoln defeated McClellan by a large margin. The people had shown their support for the man who had dedicated himself to freeing the slaves. The Union troops continued to have success. General William Sherman and his army advanced from Tennessee into Georgia, and on Christmas Day, they captured Savannah. The end of the war was close at hand. Late in March 1865, the president decided to take a short vacation, the first since he entered the White House in 1861. With a few friends, he went to City Point on the James River, where Grant had his headquarters. General Sherman came up for a meeting. The 2 generals were confident that the end of the war was near, but they were also certain that there must be at least one more great battle. "Avoid this if possible," said the president. "No more bloodshed. No more bloodshed." On April 2nd, both Richmond and Petersburg were evacuated by the Confederates.
The Battle of Five Forks on April 1st, 1865 helped seal the fate of Petersburg and Richmond. Lee was planning for an escape out of Petersburg and Richmond to move south and link up with General Joseph Johnston, who was fighting against Sherman. Lee could hold out in the Blue Ridge Mountains. There's even talk of the Confederates conducting a guerrilla style of warfare, a tactic that could prolong the war for years and a tactic that torments Lincoln. The North is tired of war. By April of 1865, there are more anti-war and anti-Lincoln protests in the North than there were battles in the Civil War. If Lee escapes into North Carolina, the North could rise up and demand an end to the war. Lincoln tells Grant to offer lenient terms of surrender. In the Battle of Five Forks on April 1st, Union victory meant Lee would have to abandon Petersburg and Richmond. Lee would have to withdraw westward in an attempt to get beyond Grant so that he could move south to link up with Joseph Johnston.
Grant himself focused on defeating Lee's army of 100,000 men. Lee's army had fought a heroic defense, but by April of 1865, just 16 miles southwest of Petersburg, Grant's troops broke through Lee's defensive line. The Union forces overran the Southern lines at almost every point. Eventually, Lee and the Confederate government were forced to abandon their defenses at both Petersburg and the Confederate capital, Richmond. The Confederates burned their arsenals and warehouses to prevent the Yankees from getting guns and supplies. When the Union troops marched into Richmond, the city was battered and blackened. Out in the field, General Lee's half-starved Confederates struggled to maintain a fighting position until, finally, they were surrounded by Grant's army. Graciously, General Lee accepted General Grant's terms of surrender on April 9, 1865, at a small village called Appomattox Courthouse. The official document of surrender was signed on April 18, 1865. The surrender of Lee's army signaled the end of the Confederacy. On April 26, Confederate Commander Joseph Johnston and his 37,000 Confederates surrendered to General Sherman. Within a month, other Confederate generals, Taylor and Smith, had surrendered their troops. On May 26, 1865, the war was officially over. A total of almost 175,000 Confederates had laid down their arms.
On Monday, April 3rd, from Petersburg, Virginia, Grant is able to see Lee's army marching across the river. Any order of cannon fire would kill hundreds. With the war's end in sight, he holds off, thinking that killing hundreds of fathers and sons will hurt the nation's healing afterward. This is a compassion he would come to regret. He wants to capture, not kill, so he gives chase to General Lee. He aims to get in front of Lee to cut him off. Lincoln also will get a memo that Richmond has fallen. This is great news, but Lee's army is still on the move and the war is still going on. On April 4th, Robert E. Lee and his soldiers are marching 40 miles to dine on anything they can find as Grant is in pursuit. If he can get to Amelia Courthouse, they can eat. There's stockpiles of food there. From there, they'll march to North Carolina. The day-and-a-half march is getting tougher, mile by mile, and with the soldiers' wretched physical conditions after months in the trenches and their feet having lost their calluses, plus the lack of food and sleep, the army of Robert E. Lee is in disarray. There is no longer military discipline and no attempt to enforce it. The columns resemble a mob of hollow-eyed zombies instead of a high-skilled fighting force. Only new clothes or warm coats were taken off of dead Union soldiers. Given a choice, the risk of getting shot by friendly fire since they were wearing Union clothing was better than being cold on a chilly night. Bellies rumble, and no one sings or gives orders. There was real fear of the Union launching a surprise attack. The men of the Confederate Army even begin to desert. Lee's strategy will be to harass the enemy, if not destroy them, and it depends on motivated troops and favorable terrain. Any fight, though, had to wait till they got food. To lighten the load, Lee orders all unnecessary guns and wagons to be left behind. Everything about the retreat says failure, starvation, poor morale, desertion. Yet, when Lee gets the message that the Petersburg bridges were blown up, he's optimistic since Grant can't follow him. Grant is pursuing Lee, though, by moving west. Now, Lee thinks he can defeat Grant on open ground, but everything depends on getting to Amelia Courthouse and getting food. Lee's optimism filters down the ranks, and his army begins to gain hope and confidence. Lee and the soldiers do get to Amelia Courthouse before Grant. The trains are there. They slide the doors open, and then horror. There are 200 crates of ammunition and other war supplies, but no food. Soldiers had marched in with hopes of food and sleep, but there was none. By April 5th, many went into the woods, claiming to be looking for food, but were really just leaving the war. Lee's optimism is replaced by a feeling of defeat. His eyes are red as if he were weeping. His cheeks are sunken. His face is colorless. He has agony written all over him. The Confederates and Lee rest their hopes on forage wagons scouring the countryside for food, but those wagons come back empty. Lee gets word that Union cavalry intercepted a column of supply wagons that raced out of Richmond. It's April 5th and Lee has to move. His fallback plan is to march to Danville, which is about 100 miles south. As impossible as it is to think of marching that distance on empty stomachs, it's Lee's only hope. Lee is willing to demand incredible sacrifice to avoid the disgrace of defeat. Lee faces a Union roadblock at Jetersville. He quickly swings his army west towards Painville. Creeks and rivers are overflowing from recent rains, which drench the troops at all crossings. Now, soaking shoes and socks will add to the agony. The region's topography favored an army waiting and launching a surprise attack, but Lee's army was one in retreat. Union cavalry harassed the rear of Lee's exhausted column, burning over 200 Confederate supply wagons, took prisoners, and created confusion and panic in the Confederate lines. Lee orders his cavalry, under his nephew General Fitzhugh Lee, to attack the Union cavalry before they can get back to safety. This is proof that there is still fight left in Lee's army. Lee marches his men all day and night, starving and sleep deprived. When they stop to rest, most sleep and some refuse to go on. Some are just too weak. Lee's army dwindles. The 30,000 that left Petersburg has been cut in half. Many stagger and lose power of speech. Still, when it comes to fight, they'll be able to. The reason many of Lee's men can still go on is because they want no part of Lincoln in the North and would rather die in battle than the alternative. This is the divisiveness that Lincoln faces. Lee got some good news. 80,000 rations were rushed to Farmville, which is 19 miles away. He can be there in a day, and so he swings his army while Grant is on a midnight ride to catch up with Lee. Farmville is only a short march from High Bridge, a stone and wood structure that can handle an army. If Lee gets there, crosses, then destroys the bridge, then his escape will be complete. Grant needs a general who will attack day and night, fresh or exhausted, sick or healthy. General George Meade isn't that type. Now, it's not merely a question of heart, but logistics. It's impossible for Meade to get to Farmville before Lee. It will take a fast, mobile fighting force to beat Lee. That will be Sheridan's cavalry. Lee understands the suffering of his men, but still presses on. Rations are waiting in Farmville. Rice's station is crossroads. One way gets to the Carolinas, the other back to Petersburg. Farmville is only a mile away. By April 6th, the plan is to get there, eat, then march to High Bridge, burn the bridge, and get into the Carolinas. Escape is very close. Lee gets grim news that Union cavalry was galloping ahead towards High Bridge to burn the bridge to block Lee. General James Longstreet orders General Thomas Lafayette Rosser to go after the Union bridge burners, capture or destroy their detachment, even if it takes the last man of your command to do it. Rosser had dropped out of West Point 2 weeks before graduating to join the Confederacy when the war broke out. He's always daring, even having been wounded several times. Longstreet knows Rosser wouldn't be afraid of the kill or be killed order, and Rosser won't let him down. Lee wonders how long till his whole army and wagons catch up. With every passing second, Grant's scouts get closer. Lee has to get over High Bridge by the end of the day. Union forces are going to burn High Bridge. 2 units are infantry and 1 is cavalry. If they were all cavalry, Rosser would never catch them. Union Colonel Francis Washburn knows what's going on, so he orders his cavalry forward and the infantry to guard the rear. Washburn is joined by General Theodore Reed, who's on a daring mission to warn Washburn the Confederates are hot on his trail and that a small force of rebels were dug in around High Bridge. A direct frontal assault would leave Washburn's men badly battered. Washburn and Reed go over strategy. The land between Rice's station and High Bridge is a swampy area with creeks, sand, and hills, which takes away the advantage of speed. Still, they gamble. Washburn is to go to High Bridge. The war could be over by sundown. Suddenly, Washburn is ambushed. He gives chase, but it's a clever trap. Washburn quickly realizes the rebels can still fight, but he also knows he's the one who could end the war and go down in history if he burns the bridge. Washburn is a quarter mile from High Bridge, but Confederate cavalrymen found him. They've been in the saddle since 4 a.m., and it's now noon. The men and the horses are exhausted. They gallop their weary horses up Chatham Plateau, expecting a minor battle. They were wrong. 1,200 Confederate cavalry wait to attack Washburn with 800 infantry and only 79 cavalry. Washburn's infantry is pinned down and cut off from Grant's whole army. Washburn feels his only hope is to be bold, so the cavalry and infantry attack, hoping to punch a hole through the Confederates. Initially, the succeed-at-all-cost desperation charge causes panic in the rebel lines. The battlefield splits in two. Stunningly, after the cavalry charges, the infantry doesn't move, staying down and dooming what could be a success. Rosser senses what's happening and doesn't waste a second as he prepares a counterattack. Fighting is hand-to-hand on horseback. It's life and death between individuals. The grassy plain runs blood red. Union infantry, not obeying Washburn's orders to attack, sealed their fate. Rosser leads his cavalry back to Lee, confident he saved the Confederacy. Lee now has his escape, or at least it appears. Lee thinks the Union force is a lot bigger than it is. He doesn't have his cavalry to go scout, so he has to guess, and he guesses wrong. He thinks Sheridan is already in front of him, so he holds his army at Rice's Station at a time when it's crucial to be on the move. Union Cavalry General George Armstrong Custer succeeds in putting a permanent wedge in Lee's army. The Confederates hold off several Custer assaults and retreated in hopes of reaching Lee at Rice's Station. More than 2,600 Confederates are captured, including General Richard Ewell. A portion of his men are trapped on a grassy hillside a few miles up a stream called Sailor's Creek. The Confederates there are ready for a fight, and it will be one of the most barbaric and ferocious battles of the war. Lee's hopes relied on his supply wagons crossing the narrow bridges and double bridges around Big Sailor's Creek and Little Sailor's Creek. Wagons were too far away for Lee to protect. He hoped that the Union would be too slow. Grant's army is in sight. Wagons do try to cross double bridges 2 and 3 at a time. The wheels got tangled. One of the bridges collapsed and the Confederate advance was halted. George Meade's infantry attacks. Rebels abandon their wagons and flee on foot into the woods. The Confederate infantry is a few hundred yards ahead, poised to meet the Union attack. Union artillery is too much and is able to push the Confederates. Darkness becomes the only hope for the rebels. Many rebels quit right there. A soldier needs food, sleep, and bullets in a war. The rebels have none. Others begin to splash across Sailor's Creek. Hope comes from Robert E. Lee, who spent the afternoon on horseback trying to find his army. Lee sees his men retreating, looking like a harmless mob, and says, "My God, has the army dissolved?" 2 miles south of Lee's viewpoint is the most ferocious battle of the war. Rebels have the higher ground. If the Union attacks, they'll be under fire as they wade across the river, and if they do get across, they'll have to fight uphill. The Union artillery fires. Confederates don't have artillery to fight back, so the rebels hug the ground praying they don't get hit. Union soldiers cross the stream under artillery protection and start going up the hill, believing the South is ready to quit. Confederates only have 1 or 2 shots, so they have to make each one count. Union soldiers look unprepared for a fight. The front Union line goes down. The second runs back down the hill. The rebels are crazed with the lack of food and sleep, plus the long march. They chase the Union soldiers. Union soldiers gather themselves, turn, and fire. The rebels are outgunned, so they have to go back. Union soldiers surround the Confederates, who refuse to surrender. There is hand-to-hand combat. Some rebels killed other rebels wearing Union coats. This battle is little remembered in history, but witnesses swear they never saw more suffering than they did at Sailor's Creek. It got worse. Custer's cavalry came in behind rebel lines. The infantry didn't want to be left out. More rebels were cut down, and they finally surrendered. One Confederate corps managed to escape. Lee sees them and grabs a flag to wave for them. The rebels were saved by darkness. The day had started good for the Confederates at Rice's Station and High Bridge. Lee will continue to try to escape, but without 13 battle flags, 300 wagons, 70 ambulances, and almost 8,000 men. 10 of Lee's top officers are killed or captured. The night ends what becomes known as Black Thursday to the Confederacy. The Union would issue 56 Medals of Honor for that day. Lee is surrounded on 3 sides, cornered in the little village of Appomattox Courthouse. After escaping Sailor's Creek, some rebels got to Farmville and were attacked before they finished eating their rations. They raced across High Bridge but couldn't burn it. The Union followed them and quartered them at Appomattox. Lee's final hope was that General John Gordon could punch a hole in the Union line. He could not. Lee said there was nothing left for him to do but go see Ulysses Grant.
On April 9th, Confederate General Robert E. Lee surrendered to General Grant at Appomattox. It was only a matter of days before there would be a total surrender. On Good Friday, April 14th, the newspapers throughout the North published an order from the Secretary of War stopping the draft of men into the Army and the purchase of arms and ammunition. At 12 o'clock noon, the Stars and Stripes were once again raised over Fort Sumter. In the week following Lee's surrender, Lincoln was uplifted. The war had ended, and the Emancipation Proclamation would give countless people a better life. He would be able to put his energy towards Reconstruction. He told people, "I've never been so happy in my life." Lincoln had begun to relax. He spent time with his son Tad. His oldest son Robert was back from the war and spent a week with the family before going back to his studies at Harvard. Robert had been a member of Grant's staff and was able to give his father a first-hand account of the surrender. President and Mrs. Lincoln were invited to attend a performance of the play Our American Cousin. They asked General and Mrs. Grant to attend with them. The Grants planned to attend, but at the last minute, they decided to go to Philadelphia. The Lincoln's son Robert also declined, saying he was too tired to go. Then they invited Major Henry Reed Rathbone and his fiancée Clara Harris to sit in their box. Lincoln's mood had changed from elation to depression. The night of the performance, he told his bodyguard that he believed he would be assassinated. Sometime after 10 o'clock, a 26-year-old actor named John Wilkes Booth entered the theater and went to Lincoln's box. The guard who was to protect the president had taken a seat in the theater to watch the play. Booth entered the president's box, drew his pistol, and fired just behind the president's head. The bullet struck him behind the left ear and went through his brain. Rathbone struggled with Booth, but Booth leaped from the box, catching his spur. He broke his leg in the fall, but was able to hobble away. As he left, Booth screamed to the crowd, "Sic semper tyrannis," which means, "thus ever to tyrants," and is the motto of the state of Virginia. Before the audience realized what had happened, he escaped. Lincoln died the following morning, the 15th of April, at 7:22. Lincoln's assassination had been planned months in advance. Booth and his co-conspirators also planned to assassinate General Grant and Secretary Seward at the same time. All the conspirators were apprehended. It took 12 days to capture Booth and another accomplice, David Herold, who had been hidden by Confederate sympathizers. Secretary Stanton had given orders that Booth was to be brought back alive. Sergeant Boston Corbett was so overcome with emotion when he spotted Booth, he shot him. Booth's last words were, "Tell my mother I died for my country and I did what I thought was best." There were 8 conspirators who were tried by a military commission. David Herold, George Atzerodt, Louis Payne, and Mary Surratt were hanged. The commission voted life imprisonment for Dr. Samuel Mudd, Samuel Arnold, Michael O'Laughlin, and 6 years of hard labor for Edmund Spangler. Lincoln was the first American president to be assassinated. Washington mourned the president for almost a full week before the funeral train left on its slow journey back to Lincoln's home in Springfield. Mourners lined the railroad tracks at all hours of the day to get a glimpse of the train that carried their beloved president, the man who had addressed an Indiana regiment on March 17, 1865, and said, "With malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right, let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and his orphan, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations."
On the morning of April 14, 1865, Lincoln continued his work on the difficult problems of Reconstruction. He once told a reporter,
"I've made up my mind that if someone wants to kill me, he will do it."
that evening, while watching a play at the Ford's Theater, Washington, D.C., Abraham Lincoln was shot in the head and killed by his assassin, John Wilkes Booth. And so, this simple man of compassion, whose grand purpose was to keep the nation united, was laid to rest. As the country mourned over its fallen leader, Vice President Andrew Johnson quickly stepped in and took over the powers of the presidency. He, too, wanted to help the people of the South and continued with most of Lincoln's Reconstruction plans. Johnson soon pardoned the Confederates to help them and their states regain their powers in government. He declared that under the Constitution, they were never separated from the Union and that their legal rights should not be denied. Yet those in Congress questioned.
Gentlemen, isn't the president's plan too easy on the South? It must not be forgotten that the people of these Confederate states, without just cause, rose in rebellion against the United States. They destroyed national forts, arsenals, dockyards, and waged a 4-year war against our government. And now, our illustrious President Johnson would let these former Confederates gain power once again in the South. Isn't this the ultimate treason? It is Congress who should have the power to reconstruct the South, not the President.
Northerners' worst fears were that the former Confederates were attempting to bring back slavery. For example, many planters needed workers on their land. Often, blacks were offered the job to farm the planters' land in exchange for a small share of the harvested crop. This type of work was called sharecropping. Unfortunately, many planters often deceived the black workers and confined them to one plantation, much as slavery had done. In the South, from 1865 to 1866, laws called the Black Codes were made specifically to keep blacks from being free. Many communities required blacks to be off the streets by a specified hour. Other communities required special permission from their employer to enter a town. And often, blacks were not allowed to handle firearms or other weapons. The Black Codes passed by the Southerners convinced the radical Republicans in Congress that the Lincoln-Johnson plan did not help blacks. Congress challenged the president's policy and promoted their own Reconstruction laws. In 1865, the 13th Amendment to the Constitution was passed, prohibiting slavery in the United States. This was a primary benefit gained by the terrible price of the Civil War. In 1866, Congress passed the 14th Amendment, guaranteeing federal citizenship to blacks.
This law declares that no state shall deprive any person of rights of life, liberty, or property without due process of law.
In 1869, Hiram Revels of Mississippi became the first black U.S. Senator. Eventually, 22 blacks became members of Congress. On the home front, Reconstruction influenced the state's political events. During the winter of 1867 to 1868, 10 southern states held state constitutional conventions. Since most of the political leaders of the South were part of the Confederacy and considered traitors, they could not participate in designing the state's principles and framework of government. Therefore, the delegates to these conventions were dedicated blacks of the Republican Party, along with anti-secessionist whites from the South known as scalawags, and bold whites from the North known as carpetbaggers. Together, they wrote good constitutions for each of their states, which provided for public schools and equal rights for all of the state's citizens, regardless of race. As the states approved their new constitutions and the 14th Amendment, they were readmitted back into the United States with full states' rights. In 1866, Tennessee was readmitted into the Union. Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Florida, Alabama, Arkansas, and Louisiana were readmitted during the year of 1868. Georgia, Mississippi, and Texas were readmitted by 1870. Not to let their home state be ruled by freedmen, scalawags, and carpetbaggers, many secret societies evolved to stop this progress of Reconstruction. Based on the concept of white supremacy, thousands of respectable and not so respectable white citizens disguised themselves and rode at night to beat, whip, or lynch the blacks and whites promoting Reconstruction. Defending themselves as peacekeepers, horrible violent crimes were committed by these groups known as Knights of the White Camellia, the White Brotherhood, or the Ku Klux Klan. In spite of the racism prevailing in the South, many blacks accepted the challenges of citizenship and endeavored to make a living. Many tried to find land offered by the Homestead Act.
40 acres and a mule were promised to us, but rarely delivered. Some properties in the South were given to us freedmen, but most of the land available was poor and no good.
Eventually, some blacks sought the open frontier in the West, finding free land available to homesteaders. As the years of Reconstruction passed, the South became more determined to take control and to end Reconstruction. Blacks were intimidated to not vote. Federal troops grew weary to protect civil rights, and many Northerners lost interest in reforming their Southern neighbors. During the 1876 presidential election between Republican Rutherford B. Hayes and Democrat Samuel J. Tilden, a dispute occurred questioning who had won. To settle the question, Southern Democrats agreed to let the Republican Hayes be president under the condition that all federal troops be removed from the South. This 1877 bargain brought an end to Reconstruction and the freedoms of blacks. Nevertheless, the ideals of Reconstruction were now secured in the Constitution. These amendments later helped lawmakers attack the injustices of prejudice and rightfully defend the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s. During Reconstruction, the slaves were freed. A president was assassinated. Civil rights were protected. Johnson's impeachment failed. States were reunited. Freedmen voted. White supremacists terrorized. And Southern states returned to home rule. Major John William DeForest of the Freedmen's Bureau aptly expressed the lessons learned from the Civil War and Reconstruction. These are his words.
For the sake of the entire Republic, we should endeavor to make our citizens feel that they are Americans and nothing but Americans. Let us remember the fact
that no section of the community can be injured without injuring the other sections, that the perfect prosperity of the whole depends upon the prosperity of all the parts.
By learning from the mistakes of the past, hopefully Americans shall grow in knowledge and seek a better America for tomorrow.